even when it's been manifestly proven that security isn't there anymore. Right? It never really was. Right? But like, you know, if the 4 offices beside you are empty, and you say, oh, but I'm secure, right? Or at least I'm more secure than they are, so this is better. So you just hang on to it. Right? Versus just being able to open your arms, take the lead. Okay. There's a really good booklet sometimes downstairs you can find on the web from Master Shigen about 100 things that you should do in life.
Yes.
Okay. So a lot of you have probably seen it. One of them that I really love is you should get rid of all your possessions and start over. Right? What are you holding on to? Temporary appearances, right? Allegiance. Right? Things that we think make us safe. Right? Those things are just as impermanent. So, yes.
I have a question. I'm trying to reconcile the identifying the causes and effects, and this is going back to the example of squatting that bug or killing that person. What if you're walking in a park and you squat that bug unknowingly, and what if you cut off somebody in traffic and they end up killing themselves? This isn't something that you would have identified on your own. This isn't something you would have been aware of, that an effect, a cause of mine has led to such a dramatic effect. How do you reconcile that?
Haven't we talked about this before?
Yeah.
So can anyone help us out?
Intention.
Can you say
Depends
what
on
you-
your, it depends. Depends on your intention, so.
If it was a one-word answer, we didn't do
Yeah,
it.
if it's unintentional, then karma won't have the same effect on your karma, right?
But nonetheless, will you still have an effect, nonetheless?
Of course, always.
Okay. There's different kinds of not knowing things, right? If it's truly unintentional, like you had no idea, you had no intention, there's nothing in your mind to say I did this, right? There's no effect, right? At least in your mind. Right? So there's really no effect. There's no repercussion. Right? It's just something that happened. The effect for the bug is much more serious. Right? The bug's karma has certainly changed. But for us, like if there isn't that intention, it's really kind of no impact on us. There's another kind of not knowing things, which is just kind of being intentionally oblivious. Right, where you know, okay, well, if I go running through the park, I'm going to squash things. I'm just going to not think about it. Right, I'm just not going to worry about it. Right, so that action of saying I'm not going to think about it, I'm not going to acknowledge it, that has an effect. Right, so you know how they say a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. Might be kind of like that. There's a good story I told to some of you last week about 2 monks standing by a river, and there's a ferry going across the river, and they're watching the ferry go across. And so the ferryman is taking the passengers, he brings them up onto the shore on the other side. And the younger monk notices that there's all these shellfish and oysters and whatnot that are being crushed by the boat as it's being dragged up onto the shore to let the passengers off. So the younger monk says to the senior monk, he says, like, look at all this killing going on, right? Look at all this killing, and who's at fault? Like, who's going to experience the karma? Right? Whose fault is it? And the other monk says, well, what do you mean? Well, the younger monk says, well, is it the passengers, right? Because they had the intention to get across the river, or is it the ferryman who actually enabled them to have the boat in the first place? So, like, it's his fault these creatures were killed. Is it the creature's fault? Is it the shellfish fault because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time? Right? Is it something to do with their karma and it's their fault they got killed? Right? Which is the same question we ask when there's a disaster. Right? When people get killed in floods or other things. Is it their fault because they were there? So, how many people think it was the ferryman? How many people think it was the passengers? How many people think that it was the shellfish? How many people have no idea. How many people have heard the story before? All right. So the answer, of course, that he said, so the younger monk is asking this question, whose fault is it? And the older monk says, it's your fault.
Because he was watching it?
Not because he was watching it, right? Because his thoughts were going towards blame, towards, assigning judgment. Right? The only bad intention that was going on, the only bad causes that were being created were on the part of that monk. Right? So he was the one experiencing the effect. Right? So I hope that answers the question. Okay. So events depend on the law of cause and effect. This one we've actually mostly talked about, so we should be able to get through it fairly quickly. I think it's a short passage. Volunteer? Oh, come on. Thank you. Microphone, please.
Events depend on the law of cause and effect. The arising of phenomena, appearances, and events require causes and conditions. But it also underlies the universal principle, which is the law of cause and effect. If you plant a pumpkin seed, you will not reap a tomato. Causes of one type produces effects that are not consistent with that type. This is a certain truth. No event can occur which is against this law.
So I think we... Thank you. Okay. That better? Okay. So what this is saying, when we're talking about positive and negative actions and how they result in positive or negative effects. Right, so this again is part of teaching on karma. It makes sense, right? I know when you ask, if you say, if I plant an apple seed, what kind of fruit would I eventually get if all the conditions were right? No one would say pumpkin, no one would say orange. Right, it's always going to be an apple, right? The effect corresponds to the cause. Right, so very simple. Right, the problem is that most of us don't actually act like we believe it. Right, we think that we can do a bad action and have a good result. Right, or we see people doing good actions and experiencing what we think are bad results. Right, so just, it's a law of nature, cause and effect. It can't happen that way. Right, and this is also like the law of karma. Right, but we get confused. We think it's okay. We think we do something bad, like cheat on our taxes. Right, so just a little white lie, no victimless crime. Right. So we think that somehow, and we get extra money back, or we save more money, and we think that this is a good result from a bad action. Right? But you see the problem. Is it? So yeah, I have extra money. What else is going on? What happens?
Other people have less?
Other people have less, certainly. What else? You begin to feel guilty. Some people do. Bernie Madoff, probably not so much. But what happened to him? Jail, right? He got caught. Right? And actually sometimes, like, the punishment, the result that society imposes on us is actually worse than the magnitude of the crime, although in Madoff's case, not so much. But certainly, like, that can happen. Right? So immediately there's the risk of being caught. There's guilt, there's fear. There's also the fact that if I do it in one thing, if I establish this habit of it's okay, if I don't see any victims, it's okay to do something bad. If I don't see the results, that just kind of sets up yourself for the future to do something else. Maybe look for other loopholes. Right? And before long, you're very confused. Right? One of the precepts is not stealing. Right? And we apply that even to borrowing a pen without asking. Right? right? Not because the person would mind, not because it's a big deal, but because it pollutes our mind. Right? And that's kind of the most immediate karma. Right? Some of these karmas, they might take a long time to manifest because of cause and condition, but the effects on our mind are almost always immediate. Right? So all of a sudden, we have this idea, this confusion. This confusion in our minds that, well, maybe, this bad action had a good result. Even though karma tells us, experience tells us that that won't be the case in the long term. But in the meantime, our minds are confused and polluted. Right? We now think that maybe it is okay. Maybe Buddha was wrong. Maybe cause and effect doesn't apply. Right? Whereas if you just look at life, cause and effect always applies. Right? But we kind of fool ourselves now into maybe thinking that it doesn't. So what's the effect of that? Right? Is it all of a sudden we're now in a life where we don't know what's going on, we're just, happy exchanging that for a bit of money? Right? Instead of actually keeping our eyes open and seeing what's going on around us. So, that's number 3. Many come from one. Oh, question, yes, please.
Hey, sorry, I just wanted to jump in before you started the topic. Can we talk about the shellfish for a second?
Sure.
Okay, you were saying that, like...
Or shellfish.
Yeah. Okay, like, I know what you're saying, like, there's lots of things, like, lots of little stories about, like, 2 monks are talking about karma, and the end result of the thing is that they basically say, like, karma basically only exists if you believe it exists, type of thing. Like, if, like, the bad karma only comes when you, like, assign blame, like, to yourself, etc., etc. But, like, think about the implications of this. Like, if that's the case, then, like, a murderer would never face negative karma if they themselves didn't believe in the negative karma. Like, you're saying that, like, the blame existed in the monk, like the bad karma arose when the monk assigned blame. So consequently, if the fisherman, or like, no, sorry, not the fisherman, but like the boatman and the other people actually involved didn't assign blame, then logically there should be no karma, right? And on a broader scale, if nobody blames themselves, there is no karma ever. So, like, a natural consequence of this type of like worldview is that any murderer or anybody without a natural conscience would get away with everything because they don't blame themselves for anything. And another thing too is that like, yeah, I forgot my second point just instantaneously there. But there's a second point.
Probably gonna have enough time just to deal with the first one, so why don't we try that? But anyway.
Go.
Okay, thank you. By the way, Alex came up to me afterwards and said something to me, and then he said, "Checkmate."
It was a checkmate though. It's pretty
Was
good.
it? Yeah.
But I thought it was.
He
When you
thought
started,
he had me, but he didn't. So, yeah.
no, I did. Okay.
I'm joking, I'm sorry. Okay. So cause and effect, as we said, very complex.
Sorry. I remember the second point. It does like 100% relate. It's just like, okay, if you basically have to like believe in negative karma to accrue it, then logically the best thing to ever do for someone is just to never tell them about negative karma, because then they will never get negative karma, and thus they will only get good karma, and thus they will just automatically become enlightened.
So unfortunately, cause and effect doesn't only exist in the mind.
That's what the many stories like explicitly state.
It's because it's not denying that cause and effect doesn't exist in the outside world, but it's because we usually don't acknowledge what's going on in our mind, what's going on in our thoughts. There need to be so many stories about how karma is created in the mind. Right? But it doesn't mean that if I don't believe in karma, if I don't believe that what I'm doing is wrong, that I won't experience any consequences. Right? And we don't need to overthink that, right? It's just evident, right? That if I go around killing someone and I don't think it's wrong, I'm still going to have consequences of that. Right? So those things are still going to happen. And it's kind of like, even though in Buddhism we say everything is really created by the mind, right? In fact, there is still an outside world. So if I'm walking along and I see a coil of rope in the dark, right, and I think that's a snake, it's still a coil of rope, right? But if I'm startled, I run, right? And then I wind up running because it's dark, I run off the edge of the cliff because I thought it was a snake. That's kind of karma from my mind, right? But if I just realize what it is and look at it and say, oh, take a minute to assess the reality of the situation, rather than just, because I think it's a snake, it is a snake, right? It doesn't happen that way. Right? Not everything is, the external reality is not what the internal reality is. That's part of a problem. Right? So we actually need to assess what the external reality is as well.
I completely agree that like external reality is completely separate from the mind, but like.
I didn't say it was separate.
Okay, but I agree with what you're saying. I misworded what I just said. The thing is though that like parts in Buddhist scriptures like explicitly state that the mind like literally creates the external world via karma, and like that's what karma is, right? It's like, so for example, it says that planets are not created by natural causes. It's like when the universe is first forming, like souls are just like floating about, and then like the desires of the minds like cause the planets to form so that the people can like inhabit that world. And the same thing, like it's supposed to be that like in the hells are literally created by people's minds, like as a result of their guilt for their negative actions, and like the demons and everything are just like not even real entities, they're just there, and they are like your own like nightmares come into like real physical form. So like again, if you didn't have any guilt over your murder, then you wouldn't create your little like fragment of hell for you to later inhabit. So again, like if you had no guilt, you would never suffer any sort of negative consequence, because again, like Buddhism says that like the whole universe is completely created by the mind, and that
That's
yeah.
ignorance, if you totally don't know what is wholesome, what is not wholesome, right?
Yeah.
I know what you're saying.
Okay. So we're kind of short in time, so I need to kind of wrap this part of the discussion up. But the short answer is that it's not as simple, right, as saying that the universe is entirely created by the mind, or the universe is created independent of the mind. Right?
But the scriptures say it is completely caused by the mind. It's that, yeah, the universe is...
And, yeah, so some scriptures say some things because they were addressed to certain audiences for certain purposes, right, others are not. So really it's not just a matter of either or, right? So ultimately, when you get deeper into the teachings, you find out that it's actually both, right? Or neither, depending on how you want to look at it, right? And we talk about, heaven and hell, right? So for some people, they might be in this classroom and it's heaven. Other people might be in this classroom and it's hell. For others, it might be somewhere in between. So from that perspective, to that extent, we are creating our own worlds.